I'm actually I see you just spotlighted me. I'm gonna go back to gallery view so I can see everyone. And I'll invite you, if you're able to turn your camera on, that would be awesome. It's a relatively small group, so we're gonna get into some discussion, and so it'd be great to see who's here. And if that's not an option, that's also totally fine. To start, I want to just kind of go around and get a sense of who's in the room. And so if you can share your name, what pronoun you use, where you happen to be right now, and one way that you have benefited from agriculture in the past week. And because we're not like sitting in a physical circle where we can just kind of pass the conch around, I will call on folks. So I'm kind of going to just follow in the order that I see folks. So we'll start with Marie. Oh, and I think most of you are muted, so just unmute yourself when you're about to talk.
I also am known as Basia, and I've known Nati since 2009, and I really didn't have a life before that. But in 2009, I became very concerned about climate change, and I was afraid we were all going to die, like all Jews were going to die, because we lived on the coast in urban centers, and we'd starve to death because of the climate impact on agriculture. And then I found all these wonderful Jewish environmentalists that were into, conserving the land and feeding us so we wouldn't all starve to death, and doing it in a way to mitigate climate change.
Awesome, thank you. All right, moving along, Susan. And you're muted, so you'll need to unmute. There you go.
Hi, I'm Sue. I go by Sue. I'm in Western Mass, and I have a CSA, and I get vegetables till the end of October. So
awesome, great. All right, Micah.
Hi, I'm Micha. I also go by
Micha, sorry.
Both work. I use he and his pronouns, and agriculture has impacted me this week, or I've been with it because I ate food today and I ate food yesterday, so it's all around me, thank God. Yeah.
Great. Jessica.
So my name is Jessica Page, and she, her pronouns. I'm over in near Seattle on Duwamish land. And let's see, gosh, in the last week, I liked Micha's answer. That was really good as far as more on a personal fun level, like just going out in my garden, harvesting the last of our tomatoes and cucumbers for the year. It's just like, anything I get to do in the garden just brightens my day. So
Awesome, great. Jackie.
Hello, I am Jackie. I use they and she pronouns. I am calling in from Berkeley, California, and I will probably be turning my camera on and off because I am cooking and I don't want to be distracting. So I just want to put that out there. But agriculture is a huge part of my life. It has given me my community. It's connected me to my food. My relationships with farmers are some of my most cherished relationships, as well as my personal connection as a farmer with food. I met my partner at a farmer's market. Everything I do, the relationships I build are kind of all based in a love of food and a joy of agriculture and cultivating all things, including food and community, and using that pun a lot of the time. So
right on, great. Margaret.
Hi, everyone. I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to have my camera off. I'm just a little having Zoom fatigue from the workday. But I've used agriculture for, well, in addition to many of the things others have said, appreciating having a very small outdoor space with a humongous fig tree growing right now. And I've just been bringing a lot into my work life through art and integrating art and trying to help high school students cultivate a relationship with nature through going outside and drawing and writing about something from nature this week. So that it's been seems like that right time of year to be doing that in particular.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Great. Awesome. Lisa?
Hi, everybody. I am Lisa. I'm also going to be turning my camera on and off with no disrespect. I'm just trying to do household chores while I get to learn a little bit.
Yeah, great.
I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm recently separated from my wife who's in New York. And I met a woman who has a plot in a community garden in Boulder. And I have been the beneficiary of this garden all summer. And I told this woman that, you know, she asked me what I wanted to have planted next season. And I had said garlic. And I said, and by the way, you know, just so that you know, there's a Jewish tradition, she's not Jewish, there's a Jewish tradition called Shemitah, where you give your garden a rest, just like Shabbat. And she's been coming over on Friday nights, and let's just say she's been enjoying Shabbat. So she wanted her garden to enjoy Shabbat too. So she totally reconfigured her whole garden, laying down new water hose, doing a whole bunch of different things so that she could have 7 rows, so that she could put one out for Shemitah every year for me.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I'm considering that an engagement present. And that's been this past week.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Is it Nan or Nan?
Hi, Nan. I'm in Berkeley, and I'm just interested in learning a little bit about Shemitah. That's why I signed up.
Great. Awesome. Welcome. Minerva?
Hi, I'm Minerva. I'm in Orlando, Florida. Love agriculture topic and Shemitah from the Torah. So I think I want to learn more. I'm learning from the scripture, but not from the practical aspect. So I'm here to learn something that I can put in practice.
Great.
Basically.
Awesome. Great. And finally, Adriana?
Hi, my name is Adriana. I'm in Toronto, Canada. And my thing related to agriculture this week, today I helped harvest honey.
Nice. Great. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have folks. It's so cool. You know, there's obviously a sadness in not really being able to gather in person right now. But there's also this kind of added bonus of being able to have a class right now with people from like all over North America. It's really exciting. And that otherwise you kind of wouldn't, I mean, I guess it was possible before, but people just weren't doing it quite as much. So that is kind of one benefit of this moment. So again, my name is Nati. I use he, him pronouns. I live in West Philadelphia. And just a little bit of my background. I currently am the operations manager at Dayenu, a Jewish Call for Climate Action. We're a new Jewish climate change organization. And I've just been doing that for the last few months. And prior to that, for the last previous kind of 15 years or so, I was running an organization called the Jewish Farm School that ran a number of different types of programs at the intersection of Judaism and agriculture and social justice. And kind of through that work, I actually first got interested and kind of turned on to Shemitah when I was in college. A class I took, I ended up writing a paper about it. But then through my work with Jewish Farm School, I just got deeper and deeper into it. And so always excited to be teaching about it, and excited to see the buzz start to come back. You know, one of the big teachings I've tried to share around Shemitah is that it's a 7-year cycle. It's not just 1 year. It's actually a 7-year cycle, and you need to kind of be like thinking about it and preparing for it during the entire cycle. Inevitably, people tend to like get more interested in the year leading up to the Shemitah year. So here we are. The next Shemitah year starts this coming Rosh Hashanah, so just a little less than a year from now. But excited to be sharing what I have and learning from folks about the practices, the underlying values, and the implications of Shemitah. And so we had one more person join, Scott, who's also in with, oh no, yeah, Scott, can you just say a quick hello, share your name, what pronouns you use, where you are, and one way that you've benefited from agriculture this week.
This week, oh, hi, I'm Scott, I live in Vermont. I'm an old friend of Nati's, actually saw you speak on the Shemitah year. Oh, well, close to 7 years ago. So the cycle revolves. And well, we grow vegetables on the side here. My parnasa, my livelihood's a librarian, but the season continues. So this week we harvest a lot of winter squash, and it was a nice harvest.
Awesome, great.
I look forward to the talk.
Yeah, great, good, nice to see you. And Sue also just joined us. Sue, if you wanted to say a quick hello, name, pronoun, where you are, and one way that you've benefited from agriculture this week.
Sure. Sue Salinger, calling in from Ecar Farm, where I just left right now, left a minute ago. I benefited from agriculture by learning that we really have to be responsive to the seasons. We're going to have a freeze tonight, so we did quite a lot of work to get food out to folks today.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, and I guess I'll answer that question as well. One way that I benefited from agriculture this week, or right now actually, is I'm drinking a cup of tea with some honey in it. And I did nothing to produce those products other than purchase them. And which is one of the kind of primary benefits of agriculture, is that most people don't actually have to be involved in the producing of food, because agriculture allows a small group of people to grow food for many other folks, and lets the other folks do other things like talk about agriculture and Jewish traditions. Yeah, and so my kind of entry point into Jewish farming was through this practice of the sabbatical year. I just found it like really kind of, like Jesse said, like kind of mind-blowing and radical when I first encountered it. And then I kind of worked backwards from there and said, well, if that's what, if that's kind of one of the core elements of the Jewish agricultural tradition, what else does Judaism have to say about farming? So this class is going to be kind of an exploration of the role of farming in the biblical text, try to understand kind of what the biblical perspective on agriculture is. And then through kind of the stories in the Torah, we learn kind of what the Jewish response to agriculture is through the Jewish agricultural laws that are presented, of which I think of Shemitah as kind of like the pinnacle. So that's what this class will be. And then part 2 will kind of be a deeper dive into some of the specific practices, and then kind of both kind of ancient and contemporary implications for those practices. So I have slideshow that I'm gonna share my screen. So hopefully folks will be able to see that all right. And I'll kind of walk us through. Jesse, I thought I could just like attach the file into the chat, but I can't quite do it that way.
Okay, I made
so
a little bit for it.
Okay, great. So if you want, you're welcome to download this file and kind of have it open on your screen, or just be able to refer to it down the road. But for now, I'll share my screen and we'll kind of work off of that together. Okay. Can everyone see that slide all right? Yeah, okay, great, sweet. So this is from part of when I was, about a year ago, we were wrapping up Jewish Farm School. The organization closed at the end of 2019. And one of the things we did was try to take all of our like unpublished curriculum that we had developed and publish it and get it out into the world. And so we released what we called a seed packet of resources that's available, freely available to anyone who's interested. So this is just part of that. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of make a slideshow, a visual slideshow that went along with this talk that I'd given a number of times about kind of the introduction to Jewish farming. So that's what we're going to be working off of tonight. So to explore what Judaism, or at least what the Torah has to say about farming, we can start pretty early on, right? So in the creation stories in Breshit and Genesis, we have this the story of God planting a garden in Eden, and they're placing Adam, whom God had formed. We think of the first person as Adam, but in the Hebrew, there's this great play on words, or connection that's revealed through the language, which is Adam comes from the word Adama, hence the name Urban Adama. Adama meaning earth. And so it's maybe more accurate to think of Adam as the earthling. And I think that's like a subtle connection, but that actually has quite significance when you really think about if we kind of walked around with more of this ongoing understanding that we are really emerged from the earth itself, how that might change our relationship to the earth. And so in this garden, God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God took the Adam and put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and to protect it, li'ovda u'lishomra. Now there's kind of these two somewhat conflicting creation stories in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Breshit, of Genesis. And this comes from the second one, which people refer to as kind of the stewardship model. So the mandate to the humans at this point is to work and to protect the garden, which in the first creation story, there's a little bit more of they call it the dominion model, which is more of that the human has dominion over all the other creatures, which is a different type of relationship. So at least in this one, it's more of this stewardship model. And God commanded the Adam, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day you eat of it you will surely die. So I heard this beautiful teaching by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, another Philadelphian, and an elder of the Jewish environmental movement. And he said, that basically the message here is God saying, I am providing you with so much abundance. There is so much abundance in this world. There is so much abundance in this garden. You have so many things to eat from. All I'm asking is that you show the tiniest bit of restraint, right? That's all I'm asking. This one tree, let's show a little bit of restraint and do not eat from it. Well, as we know, the story goes, Adam and Eve are in the garden for like 20 minutes before they take a bite from that tree. And God's not so excited about that, so happy about that. And so unto Adam, God said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, that, as you may know the story, the snake kind of invites Eve to come along and take a bite from the tree. And and tempts her and says, you know, you're not really going to die. That's not really what's going to happen. And then Eve gets Adam to eat from it as well. So because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In suffering shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken, for you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. So there's a lot going on here, and we're gonna kind of unpack that a little bit. First of all, I mean, we're a small enough group, so if any questions come up or any comments come up, just kind of raise your hand or unmute yourself and just start talking. Totally happy to have this be interactive. So in this text, we see a few things. That first of all, the consequence, you can think of it as punishment, you can think of it as consequence for not showing that little bit of restraint from partaking in this one forbidden tree, is that they are exiled, the humans are exiled out of the garden, and that whereas in the garden, the relationship between the earth and the humans was one of intimate connection and abundance, now it's a relationship, it's an adversarial relationship, it's a curse. Curse is the ground for your sake, the ground is cursed, and that in suffering you shall eat of it all the days of your life. You're gonna have to work really hard. Whereas in the garden, there was just abundance. Now we're gonna have to work really hard. You're gonna plant stuff, but thorns and thistles are gonna grow. And you're gonna eat the grass of the field, and by the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. So this kind of not very idyllic picture of what it's like to be a farmer, right? Adam must at this point be regretting this decision. The last thing that I notice here is that for you are dust and unto dust you shall return, right? Originally, the Adam comes from the Adamah, from the earth, and now it's dust. It's afar is the Hebrew, and so there's a shift also in just the relationship. Instead of kind of being made of the kind of the soil of the earth, now it's as if the humans are just made of the dust, kind of stepping down to a lower kind of level of existence potentially. So one way of understanding this story is that what this is really talking about is the story of the agricultural revolution, and that life in the garden was representative of kind of the time of being a gatherer, where there's just abundance. We go around, we collect the food that we need. We're tending to ourselves, we're tending to the land, but we're not working it in the same kind of like exhaustive way that we are when we're engaged in agriculture. And that once we leave the garden, that's kind of telling this story. This is like the origin story of farming. And we know that like farming originated, one of the places it originated was this part of the world, you know, roughly the time of that this story takes place. And so to me, this has been like a really powerful way of thinking about really the whole book of Genesis, how you can kind of map it onto the story of the agricultural revolution and the subsequent rise of civilization. So there's a couple of kind of hints that this is maybe what's going on. First of all, we have that in the garden, there's like an abundance of plants, but what are we gonna eat when we leave the garden? We're gonna eat the grass of the field, right? And we know that like the first domesticated crops were grains, which are grasses. So, right, so that's pointing to a different diet. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. Bread is entirely an agricultural product, right? Prior to agriculture, people are not eating bread for a number of reasons. For one, we don't have permanent settlement, so we're not planting foods and staying there long enough to then harvest and process the grains and turn them into bread. But once we start farming, and that allows us to settle in places permanently, bread becomes kind of one of the cornerstones of the diet. There's a couple of one other teaching that I really like is, what exactly is going on with this tree of knowledge of good and evil? Why is it so bad for the humans to partake in this from this tree? And I heard this really interesting explanation that one way of understanding that is the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that when we eat from that, we start to think we know what we should nurture and what we should destroy. That's kind of the good and the evil. What do we support and what do we kill? And in some basic sense, that is what agriculture is. You choose certain plants and you're going to nurture those. And the plants that are not part of your plan, if they're growing where you want the other plants to grow, you kill them. So every day as a farmer, you're going out and you're making decisions about what to nurture and what to destroy. And that, whereas in the garden, perhaps that was not like a necessary analysis that we needed to do. And that somehow eating from this tree kind of puts us in this place where now we are choosing what to nurture and what to destroy. The story goes on to talk about the children of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Cain being a farmer and Abel being a shepherd. And as the famous story goes, they both bring offerings to God. God rejects Cain's offering, and in an act of jealousy, he kills his brother in the field. So thinking about this story as a bit of the kind of the mythology around the agricultural revolution, and these characters being kind of iconic characters representing the larger story. Here we have a story of a farmer killing a shepherd, which as farming communities started to, as farming societies started to develop and emerge, they were in constant tension and conflict with non-farmers, right? Farming, property becomes a big thing. When you're a shepherd, you're relying on the commons, you're migratory, you're letting your animals graze. So there's always this kind of tension between farmers and shepherds, and this gets kind of manifested here in the story of Cain. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and I just want to kind of open up, if this is the case, if we want to kind of understand this story as the story of the agricultural revolution, let's think a little bit about like what are the implications of the agricultural revolution? How did farming change our experience as human beings? And so this can be kind of popcorn style if folks want to just kind of throw out some thoughts about, what are the implications of farming? How did farming change the human experience?
Well, we needed to have this is Lisa. One second. Hi. So we needed to have a social structure for farming. We needed to have people who did certain tasks and learned certain trades around the farming, around agriculture. And
Yep.
then how to use the product of the agriculture, not only the food to cook, but also things to make clothes with.
Yep. Right. So farming, as I mentioned earlier, when you can start to have a smaller number of people growing the food for a larger number of people, that frees up other people to do other things. So that's where we start to see like a real division of labor and specialization, right? In hunter-gatherer societies, as I understand it, things were a lot more egalitarian in the sense that each kind of family unit was responsible for collecting food each day. And there was less specialization. But with farming, you can have some people growing food and other people who focus on metalwork and tools and building and clothing. And then also other things emerge. This is where we start to see kind of more organized forms of religion. So you start to have people whose sole purpose is to play the spiritual role within a community. And so you start to have these kind of like social hierarchies emerge along with this division of labor. And just as a side note, after the story of Cain and Abel, it goes on to talk. The text goes on to talk about all of Cain's descendants, And it talks about the trades that they do, different types of metal work, and things that were only possible once we started farming, once we were able to settle permanently and build forges and ovens that were hot enough to do the work with metal. As nomadic people, we were not able to do that. Okay, so we have division of labor and social and economic hierarchies. What are some other implications of farming?
Wealth accumulation, inequality.
Yes, right. So in agriculture allows us to grow a surplus, right? Which when you are a nomadic hunter-gatherer, you have limited utility for surplus because you're moving around. There's only so much you can actually carry. And so there's a limit to how much extra stuff you're trying to have. But once we start settling permanently through agriculture, and in a good year you're growing a surplus, that essentially is wealth creation, right? This is a much more efficient or effective form of wealth creation. And with that wealth creation, you start to get economic hierarchies. So you have a surplus, but who controls that surplus? Who's in charge of it? And often the social and economic hierarchies are connected. Well, one of the things that you need when you start to have that surplus and you start to have hierarchies is you need people whose sole purpose is to protect that surplus for those who are in power. And the nice thing about agriculture is that it allows you to have a dedicated army or dedicated police force, because those people don't have to be growing the food themselves. They can just be maintaining control over that surplus. Yeah. Other implications of farming. Not all bad, there can be good ones too.
I don't know if this is a positive one. I was just thinking that it's not required for everyone to have a direct relationship with their environment, with the land or wildlife. So some people could be completely clueless about the language of the plants and the animals.
Yes, that's actually a really good point, and I hope I remember to kind of circle back to that later on in the session, because it relates to I think one of the roles that Shemitah plays. But yeah, it allows us. I mean, my sense is that like it's really much more so in this industrial age of agriculture that you can have people who kind of go through almost their entire lives with like very little nature connection or intimacy with food and how it's produced. I imagine if you go back 100 years or 200 years, because the nature of agriculture at that point was still not on the scale that it operates at now, most people still had some connection, right? Some more direct connection. But now certainly that is the case. Absolutely. Yeah, so we see some of this play out quite explicitly actually in the story of Joseph that happens a little bit later on in the text, right? So we have, can you all see the slide again? Okay. So we're going to fast forward quite a bit, right? So we go from Cain and Abel to all their descendants, and then the story of Noah, and then after that, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, Jacob. And so Jacob has all these kids, and they're living in Canaan, but there's a famine that strikes the entire region, right? And Joseph, who his brothers had sold him off into slavery, and he kind of ends up in Egypt and ends up in prison, but then has a knack for interpreting dreams and ends up becoming the right-hand man to the Pharaoh. And he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams, a series of dreams that reveal that there will be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph has the idea that during the 7 years of plenty, we need to kind of take that surplus and bring it into the house of the Pharaoh and control that surplus. And so that way, when the famine hits, we'll be able to feed people and make sure everyone has enough. Now, I remember as a kid learning this, and it was certainly kind of described as this very prudent and wise and kind of caring and thoughtful act on the part of Joseph. I've since kind of come to understand it a bit more maliciously, in that it was a way for Joseph and the Pharaoh to consolidate a tremendous amount of power, right? So we see this in the text. Now there was no food in the entire land, for the famine had grown exceedingly severe, and the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted because of the famine. And when the money gave out in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, lest we die before your eyes, for the money is gone." So at first, this story is quite long, so I abbreviated it. At first, they come to the Pharaoh and they say, "Here, take our money, just give us food. Why should we starve?" But then they use up all the money. And so now they're coming back. And so Joseph says to them, "Give me your livestock and I will give you food in return for your livestock." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle, and the donkeys, and he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all of their livestock. That year ended, and they came to him in the second year, and they said to him, "Nothing remains before my Lord except our bodies and our farmland. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our farmland? Buy us and our farmland for food, so that we and our farmland will be slaves to Pharaoh, and give us seed so that we will live and not die, and the soil will not lie fallow." So Joseph bought all the farmland of the Egyptians for Pharaoh, and for the Egyptians sold each one his field, for the famine had become too strong for them, and the land became Pharaoh's. So basically what we have here is a 7-year period of famine, and by the end of the second year, all of the people of Egypt and Canaan have come to the Pharaoh and have basically offered themselves into slavery in exchange for being kept alive. All because Joseph had the idea of consolidating the surplus and maintaining power over it. And so what we see here is just how quickly the people who control the surplus are able to use that to consolidate power, and how that plays out. And so Joseph's family is actually no exception to this. They're in Canaan, but there's a famine, so they end up coming down to Egypt. At first, they don't realize it's Joseph who they're dealing with, but then they have this reunion. And he encourages them to come and settle in Egypt, and he'll take care of them. And actually, it's interesting to note, they say to him, they say, "Oh, but you're all farmers and we're shepherds. Like, where are we going to live and be safe?" So he says, "I have this land for you in Goshen. It's going to be great." So he sets them up with this great kind of pasture, great for the shepherding, and they settle there, and things are okay for that generation. And as you may know in the story, then Joseph dies and the Pharaoh dies, and there's a new Pharaoh. And meanwhile, the Israelites have started to grow, and there's a lot more of them. And the new Pharaoh is not so excited about them, and eventually enslaves them puts them into slavery, and we kind of have that experience for a couple hundred years. So it's important to remember that this is the early ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, were not farmers. They were primarily shepherds. And so shepherds are always kind of living on the margins, on the fringes of the society, quite literally, because that's where they can graze their animals. And as I mentioned, there is this kind of tension that exists. And as a brief side note, I read this essay by Chaim Nachman Bialik called Jewish Duality, where he actually kind of names this as an important element to Jewish identity, that at times in our history, we've had the kind of the energy of shepherds. And at other times in our history, we've had the energy of farmers. When we've been rooted in one particular place. Lisa, I see your hand, I'll get to you in 1 second. that we have this kind of, we embody this energy of farmers where we're kind of rooted and expansive. And at other times when we've been in exile, when we've been more nomadic, we embody this energy of the shepherd. And one of the agricultural laws, which is actually used as an example of a law that doesn't have a rational explanation, is the law of shatnez, of not mixing wool and linen. And so in this essay, Chaim Nachman Bialik has this great interpretation, which is that wool was a product of shepherds, and linen was a product of farmers. And so farmers would wear clothes that were made out of linen, and shepherds would wear clothes that was made out of wool. And so you don't want to blend the two, because you might be kind of giving off mixed signals. Who are you? Are you a farmer or are you a shepherd? But the one garment where we are actually invited to blend these two things is the talit, kind of the sacred garment, where the most of it can be made out of wool, and then the fringes, the tzitzit that are on them, can be made out of linen or cotton. And so that there's some kind of like, that the talit somehow brings this Jewish duality together, these two kind of primal energies of the farmer and the shepherd, brings them together in unison and in peace and in harmony. And I just really like that kind of side note. But so we are now kind of enslaved in this agricultural society that is oppressive. And what we see in this image is one of the things that makes the agriculture in Egypt so kind of what I think of as an ancient version of industrial agriculture, is that the Nile floods every year. And because the Nile floods, they're able to create this vast network of irrigation channels. And essentially they can grow food all year round. And because the society is exploitative and oppressive, they can continue to grow food because they're enslaving people to do it. And this is our kind of collective first exposure to farming in this highly exploitative society, and one that doesn't have any kind of natural limits imposed on it. And so then there's Moses comes around, there's the 10 plagues, the exodus from Egypt. And then we're wandering in the desert with this goal of returning to this land of Canaan, at which point we are going to become farmers. Like for the first time, really, as a nation, we're going to become farmers. But our mandate as farmers is kind of defined in contrast to our experience in Egypt. Both from an underlying values perspective, but even from a very literal physical perspective about the land itself. So here we have this from Varim, from Deuteronomy. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the divine, Holy One, and serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil, and I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. So the land itself is different than the land of Egypt, and therefore that's going to force us to engage in a different form of agriculture. And on the most basic level, we can't water our fields kind of endlessly. We are going to depend on the rain, and the rain coming in its proper time. And what we're taught through that text is that the rain is kind of a barometer of our collective moral well-being. That if we uphold the laws and values that we're given in how to live on the land, then the cycles will work. The rain will come and there will be abundance. And if we don't, what I didn't include there is kind of the next paragraph, which is like, and if you don't do that, then the rain won't come and nothing will grow and you will starve and you will basically be kicked out of the land. So our connection to that land, our presence on that land is deeply connected to how well we collectively behave. And so what I think of as that becomes kind of like the opening framing for the Jewish agricultural code, which is meant in many ways to preemptively address the injustices that we saw in our experience in Egypt and the injustices that we named already here. The social and economic hierarchies, the exploitation of workers, the exploitation of animals, the arrogance, in a sense, that Egypt operated with, right? That we are actually meant to come into this with more humility, and that's an important piece. And one thing that I really love about this is for 40 years before we enter the land, we're wandering in the desert. And what is it that we eat in the desert? We eat the manna, this kind of magical food that just appears each day. And our guidelines for that are that we should go out, take what we need each day. You can't take more than what you're going to eat in that day. The rabbis teach that if you took more than you needed, it would spoil, it would go bad. With the one exception being on Friday, you can take a double portion for Shabbat, so that you don't have to go out and collect for Shabbat. Which in a sense is kind of hearkening back to the time in Eden, where we're gathering. We're just taking what we need. We're not trying to amass a surplus. We're just taking what we need in that moment, and we're not building wealth. So the man becomes like a reversion from an agricultural way of life to one of a gathering way of life, as a way of kind of cleansing the palate before we enter into the land. So, oh, Lisa, you had your hand up a little while ago, and I never got back to you. Do you want to jump in with your question?
Yeah, I had a question about the famine and the 7 years of that whole thing. And I know we don't know really what the 7 years timeline is as compared to what ours is. But I didn't understand that if there was a famine, why did the farmers ask for seeds? Didn't they have their own seeds that they would have planted for a second year? Why did they think that the Pharaoh's stash of seeds would be better than what the farmers had already?
Right. No, it's a good. I think by that point they already had gone through a full season of not growing food, and they were living off of the surplus, and so maybe their seeds supply had run out at that point. Okay. But it's a good question. And from what I understand, during the 7 years of plenty, what Joseph actually did was essentially like enact a tax. He required that all the farmers give from their surplus into this kind of collective pool, which, had then the practice been, cool, well, you already put into this pool and now there's a famine, come and get it, and we'll just kind of manage the fair and equitable distribution of the surplus, that would have been one thing. But that's not what happened. It was, I'm now going to use this as a way of kind of leveraging power. So now we're going to start to build an agricultural society. And so we're given this blueprint, right? And it's in stark contrast to Egypt. It's kind of juxtaposed against our experience in Egypt. And here's just like a short sampling of some of the laws and practices. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, and nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and the stranger. Right, so we have here the practice of peah, of leaving the corners of our fields unharvested, and so that people who don't have their own fields can come and harvest for themselves. We leave the gleanings, leket. So kind of as we're harvesting, things that fall onto the ground, we don't go back for, we don't pick up. We leave, and then gleaners come along and can harvest. So built into our agricultural system is a safety net of sorts for people who are not farming, who don't have access to land, for the needy and for the stranger. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the stranger, for the orphan, and for the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. So this refrain gets repeated over and over and over again. Here's a practice. And why am I telling you to do this? Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Do not oppress the stranger. Do not oppress the slave. Do not oppress the foreigner. The most repeated phrase in the entire Torah is to not oppress the stranger. 36 times it's repeated in the Torah. So kind of our collective moral code is centered around this idea, and it gets physically manifested in how we grow food. We're also taught, we're given guidance on our relationship to animals. This is just a couple of things. Do not plow with an ox and a donkey harnessed together, and do not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. So Scott, you're laughing. I don't know if you have something to share. What is this about the don't plow an ox with a donkey, and don't plow with an ox and a donkey harnessed together?
At first, I thought it was just obscure, didn't make sense, but I guess they go at different speeds, so it wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, right. So the ox is much bigger and stronger than the donkey, so it's kind of like, dragging the donkey along. It's not really fair for either of them. Got a picture of that.
And there's a lot of these rules have to do with our history that we were in Mitzrayim, but some of them are just good agricultural advice. I think of the Mishnah as the first agricultural advice, extension advice. The government has the agricultural extension that teaches farmers. This was some of the first agricultural advice to the common farmer. Yeah, absolutely. These are just two laws around our relationships to animals, but the underlying value here is that we need to treat animals with respect. We can't just see them as a means to our own ends and exploit them. So we want to consider their experiences and their feelings physically and emotionally as they do work for us. Don't muzzle an ox while it is threshing. That idea is that the way we used to thresh grains, which is kind of cracking of the kernels to separate the kernel from the chaff, is we would use heavy animals that would stomp on these grains. And we're taught that we should let them snack while they're working for us. We don't want to cover up their mouths and make that experience harder for them. And then we have, and again, this is just a small sampling of some of the laws. Here we have the law of Shabbat. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been stranger in the land of Egypt. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed. Right? So in this, the Shabbat gets mentioned several times throughout the Torah, but in this one, it's actually, the rest is not for you. It's for all of the people who are working with you or for you, and the animals. It's for the animals and for the slave or indentured servant, the stranger, the vulnerable people, all of those. That's who Shabbat's for, which, we might take a little bit for granted right now, that we're all entitled to a weekend, right? At least 1 or 2 days off a week. That's, the unions got us that. And now we kind of take it for granted. But if you go back a few thousand years, who got to have a day off? It was only the wealthy and the elite. And so by instituting this practice of everyone in the community, animals, non-Jewish people who are living within your community,
everyone gets Shabbat. Every single week, everyone gets a day off is a really radical notion, and a way of flattening some of those social and economic hierarchies that exist. And then finally, we have Shemitah. And Shemitah appears 3 distinct times in the Torah. This is the first time it shows up. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat of it. And you shall do the same with your vineyard and olive groves. So I'm going to stop the share so we can, for a little bit. So this is kind of the basic premise of Shemitah, that for this year, we don't engage in any agricultural act, and so that we let the land rest and lie fallow. But kind of the reason that's given for Shemitah in this particular passage, it then says, let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat of it, and you shall do the same with your vineyards and olive groves. So what is that about? Why would this practice of letting your land rest be connected to feeding the needy? It seems like if the goal is to feed the needy, shouldn't you be farming, but maybe like just give all the food away? If you're not going to farm, then what exactly are we talking about here? How did the needy play into this? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Do you mind repeating that?
Just if the reason given for the Shemitah year, or the reason, or like kind of, if you keep the Shemitah, then it will let the needy among your people eat of it. How are those two things connected? How is the year of not farming somehow going to lead to feeding the needy people?
Would it encourage you to grow more perennials for your own sake, and therefore then allow for people to harvest from that?
Yeah, great point, right? So, and that's kind of some of the stuff we'll talk about in 2 weeks. Are, what are the practical applications or implications of Shemitah? So one of them is, all right, when it says you're not allowed to engage in agricultural activity, but then what do you eat? Well, anything that grows on its own is fair game. And it's and not only is it fair game, but in the laws of Shemitah, it actually takes on a certain sacredness called Kedushat Shvi'it, the holiness of the 7th year. And food that, and this is still practiced today, food that grows on its own during a Shemitah year in the land of Israel has certain restrictions. You're not allowed to sell it. You're not allowed to export it. You're not allowed to harvest more than you need in for your immediate needs. You're only allowed to eat the food that is growing locally in your region at any given time. So yes, and that's why we have to be thinking about Shemitah all 7 years, not just in the few months leading up to the Shemitah year, because if you want to have a robust set of perennials, you got to get them in the ground several years back. For a few reasons, it takes perennials some time to develop, and also one of our Jewish agricultural laws is the practice of orla, which is not harvesting fruit from a perennial for the first 3 years that it's growing. So if you want to have robust perennials for your 7th year, you really want to get them in the ground in your 1st, 2nd, and 3rd year at the latest. So that's where it takes some planning, right? So yes, that's part of it, right? We're gonna shift our our palette will be designed a bit around perennials. And if you think about the 7 species of ancient Israel, 5 out of 7 of them are perennials. And the other 2 are grains which often reseed. They seed themselves. And so, if those foods are the staple of the diet plus animal products, then actually a Shemitah year comes along and you're doing okay. Whereas if you eat like the standard American diet, which is so annual focused, then that's going to be a big shift. That's going to be pretty difficult.
Nati, what are the 7?
Date, olive, pomegranate, date, olive, pomegranate. Wheat and barley are the 2 grains. Grapes, and I always forget the 7. Scott probably knows. Scott, can you spit off the 7 species?
I just came back. Well, we got Ramon. We got the team.
So
We
pomegranate,
got barley.
olive,
Is it fig?
barley, fig. There you go. Great.
Fig.
Yep.
Yeah, fig.
Fig it is. Yeah.
Is that all 7?
Yeah.
Whoever said.
So
So this is wide variety. So I could see how you could live off of that for a year.
Yeah.
But I have a question too. But part of the writings on Shemitah also say that, but in the 6th year, you're going to have such a fabulous crop that you'll be able to preserve and save it. So there's something also about what's happening the year before and how you're really planning it. And I haven't really worked yet on what is that digging into what is that preservation about?
Yeah. I mean, I think at that time, the things that would be preserved the most would be grains, right? Grains could be harvested and stored theoretically for a couple of years. So if you have a real abundance of grains, and yes, my understanding is that in ancient times when Shemitah was practiced, it was a combination of perennials, animal products, stored grains from previous years, which there was like a communal storing process and distribution process. Maybe again in contrast to maybe what happened in Egypt with Joseph, and then wild edibles, and that kind of touches back on Jessica's point earlier. I think it was Jessica who said, that when we start to farm, that kind of allows some people to just like have less intimacy and less literacy when it comes to the local environment. Shemitah, if a source, one of the main sources of certainly kind of like greens is going to be wild edibles, well, then you're going to know the wild edibles. You're going to learn them in those other 6 years. You're going to know how to walk the lands and the forests near where you live and know what will feed you during the Shemitah year. So if you look at all of the kind of the food aspects of Shemitah, maybe not all of them, but at least the core of them, the Shemitah year essentially is a reversion to that pre-agricultural way of life. It's a reversion back to the Garden of Eden. And the rabbis pick up on that. I don't have it here, but I'll probably have it in the sources for next week. There's rabbis that totally pick up on it, that the Shemitah year is meant to give us a hint, a taste of what life in Eden must have been like. So we have some of those food implications. The way that I understand how this ties back to kind of letting the needy among your people eat of it, is that Shemitah can, the practices of Shemitah are a fewfold. We've talked about kind of the land, right? That you don't engage in agricultural activity, and that all private lands become commons, right? That's important. So anything that grows on its own is not just for you, the landowner, and that's where this comes in. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, the wild beasts eat of it. During the Shemitah year, your land has become commons, and one of the practices is you have to take down or open up your fences. You're not allowed to restrict access to the land, and that's where the wild animals come in. So you have to leave your land. Farms I've worked on, you put a lot of time and energy and money into putting up a deer fence, and then the Shemitah year comes along and you just have to open up the gate and just be like, may all who are hungry come and eat, animal, human, whoever. This is no longer mine. The word Shemitah literally means release. And so what you're doing in the Shemitah year is you are releasing the claim of ownership over the land, right? And that is a powerful kind of tikkun from what happens when we farm. It's like a powerful repair, right? So the way that I kind of understand this is that what our tradition, going back to this idea that like these stories in Breshit, throughout Breshit are somehow telling the story of our transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. That our tradition says, you know what? Farming has some benefits, and that is the wave that was kind of taking over human existence 10, 12,000 years ago. The people who tried to resist that transition, many of them got swallowed up by it, right? And in a sense, there's really just a tiny fraction of humans on Earth right now that don't really live in agricultural societies. So one way of thinking about this is like our ancestors saw that wave coming and said, well, if we try to resist this, we're going to fail. We're going to get swallowed up. We're going to disappear. But maybe we can jump on this train, but do things in a little bit of a different way in order to kind of preemptively address the injustices that are embedded in an agricultural society. So we're going to make sure that people who don't have access to food have access to food. We're going to make sure that we treat our animals fairly. We're going to make sure that everyone, no matter what their status is in the community, gets a day off every week. And every 7 years, we're going to revert in a much more holistic and comprehensive way. We're going to revert to a non-agricultural way of life. And I didn't mention this here, but one of the interesting laws is that the tribe of Levi, the Levites, the priests, who have the kind of the spiritual power within the community, they're the one tribe that's not allowed to own land. And so that's, I think of that as this kind of separation of power. Say, okay, you're gonna hold this role in the community. We're not gonna let you also consolidate the economic power. We're gonna keep those things separate. So we have these practices that really try to kind of preemptively address some of the injustices embedded within agricultural societies. And Shemitah is in many ways kind of the pinnacle of that. I want to just say like two quick things before we wrap. So the practices of Shemitah involve a few pieces. There is the agricultural piece where we're not farming. There's the economic piece, which is that we are kind of releasing claims of ownership over land and also over debt. At the end of the Shemitah year, any debt that was outstanding between two people gets erased, gets eliminated, as a way of, again, kind of like preventing disparities of wealth from getting too far out of control. If someone by the end of a Shemitah year doesn't have the resources to pay back a loan that, by the way, was interest-free to begin with, then we kind of wipe the slate clean. And then the third practice, which actually doesn't happen on the Shemitah year, but is connected to it, it happens every 7 years, is that indentured servants are released. And so kind of one way of understanding that is that this essentially addresses the steps that a person might take into poverty in an agricultural society. So if you have a farmer who's struggling, not doing so well, the first thing they might do is borrow some money, but they're still struggling. And then that debt starts to accumulate. They're not able to pay it back. So then they sell their land. Well, once they've sold their land, now they really don't have any way of bringing in money. So the debt keeps on growing. They don't have any land. And so what do? They end up selling themselves into like slavery or an indentured servitude agreement. And so what Shemitah does is, okay, in the Shemitah year, you don't have land, no problem. We all have access to the same commons at this point. And any food that grows is just shared equally. The poor and the rich sit at the same table in the Shemitah year. We also are going to forgive your debt. And if you had entered into indentured servitude, that is the end of your term and you are free to go. I think of it as like if you've ever played the game Monopoly. The whole point of Monopoly is to have one person consolidate all of the money, right? So after a couple hours, you got one person who owns all the property, has all the money, and everyone else is bankrupt, and that's how the game ends. So that is not necessarily the recipe that we want to follow for building an entire society. And so we need to have these kind of fixes in place, and that we have kind of on a more immediate basis, we have things like Peah and Leket, leaving the corners of the field and leaving the gleanings, so we can meet the immediate needs of people. We have Shabbat that kind of meets some of the social, spiritual, and emotional needs of people. And then Shemitah kind of addresses some of the structural issues, some of the ways that injustices and inequality get embedded in structures. Well, Shemitah tries to at least provide a pressure release valve for some of those things. Because as I understand it, the goal of this game is to keep going and never end. And that only is going to happen if there is a certain sense of a certain amount of equality, equity, and justice. And so the agricultural laws as a whole, but Shemitah kind of in the broadest sense, help create that. So I want to kind of close with this last screen share. After kind of like exploring these various laws and practices over many years, I kind of distilled out 7 core Jewish agricultural values that I think kind of animate the Jewish agricultural traditions. And so Jewish agricultural traditions compel us to create a food system that centers the needs of the most vulnerable, encourages gratitude and generosity, values physical labor, treats workers and animals fairly, and integrates cycles of sacred rest for all, facilitates emotional and spiritual connection to food, plants, nature, and wilderness, celebrates through feasting and fasting, redistributes land and wealth, and puts limits on power. And so to me, that's kind of the main takeaway of all of this, right? That like our tradition is actually quite skeptical of farming, of agriculture, and allows us to do it in a sense as a compromise, in a sense as an adaptation to like, this is what's happening now in the world. But we're gonna do this a little bit differently. And we're gonna do this in a way that leads to more equity, more justice, and more sustainability. And so, hopefully in that, these laws and practices come from a very different time and place in the world. But I think our task is to kind of dive into them, learn about them, understand these values that animate them, and really kind of think about how we can bring them to life in our contemporary setting, where we need a lot of help moving in the direction of more equity and more justice and more sustainability. Hopefully you can join us again in 2 weeks, where we'll kind of dive a little deeper into the specific practices of Shemitah and see how we can do that, see how we can kind of bring some of these values to life in wherever it is that we find ourselves right now. So with that, we'll kind of wrap, and I'm happy to hang for a few minutes if anyone has questions. I don't know if Jesse, if you want to kind of close in any specific way,